Hello and welcome back to the Staggies View podcast. As you can see in front of you, this is a very special episode. If you're watching on YouTube, we are joined for a first time, a collaboration, Ross and Stephen from the County Corner. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi guys, how we doing? For having us on, Peter. It feels like kind of a bit of a big momentous day. I mean, people have seen crossovers like Avengers Endgame and Infinity War and stuff like that, and this is our own Ross County version of that, I guess. But yeah, who knows?
Exactly, a big occasion nonetheless, but we have bigger things to talk about today. We've got the very special guest himself, the local Fabrizio Romandrew, as I like to refer to him, Andrew Henderson. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. We appreciate it a lot. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad at all, thanks. The forbidden door has officially been opened on the Ross County podcast sphere, hasn't it?
It really has.
Together.
Andrew, you're the catalyst.
Apparently so. I feel I was getting a huge intro there, and I really hope I live up to this now because it feels like that's a lot of pressure. Thanks for having me on. Very much appreciated. Obviously, you guys have mentioned me quite a lot on Staggies View over the years. That's always very much appreciated. So it's probably overdue a little bit that I actually made an appearance on it at some point. So here we are.
The amount of times we've stitched you up by going, Andrew Henderson said.
Yeah, and I've got a notepad of all the different incidents. Like one of these days, see when you, Ramsay, Peter, see when the two of you graduate and go into sports journalism, I'm going to be picking up on every single thing you two say. Just you wait. Just you wait.
Well, you're on the podcast for a special reason because you run Pride at the Terraces, and in collaboration with Highland Pride and Leap Sports. On the 9th of February at 7 p.m. at Eden Court in Inverness, you're running a panel called Seen and Heard. It comes in a good month because it's FootballvHomophobia's month of action. We'll leave their link to their socials in our description. And it's also LGBTQ History Month. So to start us off, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself and about the event?
Well, first off, well read, because that was a lot of different facts and names that you had to note there, and you got through it all very well. So congratulations on that.
Thanks.
I'm super excited about this event. Seen and Heard is a podcast that I was kind of commissioned to do at the end of 2022 for Scotland's Year of Stories by Leap Sports. And we focused on a lot of different elements of sporting life in Scotland. One of the big ones, because of who Leap are and because of a bit of my story, which I'm sure we'll get into, being the LGBT community and LGBTQ plus inclusion in sport. I've really wanted to do something in Inverness specifically for a long time. We did a panel event like this in Glasgow also towards the end of 2022. And ever since then, I've been desperate to make something happen in the Highlands because I feel like we need this sort of representation. We need this sort of visibility. For me personally, that event in Glasgow was possibly the best thing I've ever done in journalism. I was on a high for weeks, if not months afterwards. It was incredible. And being able to do something like that, as I say, in the Highlands, where I've been based for the last 6 years, where I've spoken to some LGBTQ plus athletes about their stories and hearing so many people saying they had to move away to, become their authentic selves and thrive in sport. I really feel like it has a lot of value and can have a lot of impact in Inverness and in the Highlands. So what we're going to have 2 different panel discussions at Eden Court. One of them is going to be focused all around building LGBTQ plus communities in sport with a couple of community groups who are actively doing that right now. Across a range of sports, we've got paddling with Pride coming along. So that's more water-based stuff. We've got fitness with Pride, which is a dance fitness exercise class, I guess. And we've got Leap Sports themselves are going to be represented because they run a project in and around the Highlands called Out and About. And what they've done is a load of different introductory stuff to get people trying out different sports for the first time, but also getting them socializing through sport and just generally getting them active. The second panel we've got is more around individual stories. And we've got some people who have been at the very, very top of their sports. So that's very exciting. I'm thinking there of Jamie Bowie, who's from Inverness originally, but is a Scottish record holder run at the Commonwealth Games. He has coached at the Olympics, the Paralympics. He's been back to the Commonwealth as a team manager and as a coach. He's done it all. He's currently working with the high performance squad at the Scottish Institute of Sport. We've also got, and please don't boo me when I say this, Callie Thistle women's player, Kaylee McKenzie. I know this is a Ross County podcast, and I'm sure if this happened in a couple of years, once the Ross County women's team was more established and had a couple of seasons under their belt, could easily have gotten to them for a player or two, but we do have an Inverness player in this one, I'm sorry to say, for a Ross County podcast.
They've done good work over there, to be fair.
They have. The women's team are to be fair to them, we'll give them a little bit of credit. I'm a big fan of them. Again, no, that might not go down brilliantly with this audience. And our final panelist on that is a trans woman called Blair Hamilton, who has played football to a decent level. She's represented England at universities level. But she's originally from Ayrshire. She went to the Uni of Aberdeen. She played football there, and she's also a leading researcher and academic on trans participation in sports. So there's going to be a lot of really fascinating stuff there. I think it's going to have a lot of value for LGBTQ plus people who maybe aren't that interested in sport or don't feel like there's a space in sport for them, but also for any sports fans, which is why I'm very grateful for all of you for coming together and doing this podcast with me here, because I feel like when it comes to campaigns like Football versus Homophobia or things like Rainbow Laces, we always hear it's important to be inclusive, but we don't often hear about the individual stories as to the impact that those inclusive acts and that approach can have. And this is a chance to hear that firsthand and for audience members to be able to ask a question or two themselves, because the plan is to have a wee Q&A at the end of each panel. So it'll just be a different perspective, maybe a little bit eye-opening. And if there are people involved in clubs or in different sports who come along, maybe they can even get a little bit of advice as to how to make their sport more welcoming for the LGBTQ plus community. Have I just answered every single possible question?
Yeah, very well said. That was perfect. Just one question. So do you think it's important to have it in a place like Inverness that's obviously it's very isolated, maybe rightly or wrongly, maybe it could be seen as a little bit backwards by other places? Do you think it's important to have this event in a place like Inverness, sort of, I'm not sure if break down barriers is the right way to put it, but is that one of the reasons why you're so excited to have it in the Highlands?
Yeah, for sure. That perception can go one of two ways, I've found. When you come to smaller places, even going past Inverness and into some of the towns, villages, one street places that have their own addresses and postcodes, it can either be that things are maybe a little bit less progressive because there isn't the same diversity in them, and people may be a little bit closed-minded and need to be exposed to these different perspectives in order to change some of those minds. Or it can go in the complete opposite way. And actually, everybody knows everybody and people have grown up with each other and things are fine because they're just that guy from down the street or just that girl from down the street or whatever. And even if somebody comes out as part of the LGBTQ plus community, it's fine because we've known them all their lives. They haven't changed who they are and everything's hunky-dory. But because there is still that dichotomy there, I do think it is important to have it in a place like Inverness. And so fair warning, guys, I did do a little bit of research to brush up on my stats earlier on, and I'm about to bring out the first one here. People who follow my writing might know I love a good stat when it comes to football reporting, and I've got a few of them here for you. LGBT Youth Scotland is a charity who, towards the end of last year, released a report into what life was like for LGBTQ plus young people in rural areas. Specifically, they had a whole report, a whole focus on rural areas. And what they found were that LGBT young people in rural areas thought that their communities were significantly less welcoming than LGBT young people in non-rural areas. That might not always actually be the case, but that's definitely what the perception is. So for those people who need to see that visibility, need to see that representation, this is something that for them to latch onto and see it's possible to be from this sort of area in the Highlands and be LGBTQ plus and thrive and really get to the top of their fields. But it's also about changing the perception of Inverness, I guess, a little bit. If people think that that's going to be the case for a place like the Highlands, for a place like Inverness, if they then see that this sort of event is being held at Eden Court and seeing that might then make them think, actually, maybe Inverness is a more progressive place than I thought, or maybe the Highlands is a more progressive place than I thought. As I say, that's not always the reality of the situation, but there absolutely is that train of thought there. So yeah, I think it is super important that these things aren't just all in Glasgow and Edinburgh. Regardless of what the intention behind it is, I think it's really important that events like these don't just happen in the Central Belt, particularly when it does come to LGBTQ plus topics, particularly when it does come to more rural areas like the Highlands. Yeah, I can't wait, and I really hope people come along, because that's the only way it's actually going to have that impact that I hope it does, is if people are there to sit and listen to it all. Again, if I just gone on a massive tangent.
The thing about having 4 interviews and 1 interviewee is that there's going to be a massive gap between each question, so we don't follow over each other.
It's like the exact opposite of a press conference after a Celtic or Rangers game.
Yeah, oh God, yeah.
It's all good.
Yeah. But I'll start off next, Andrew. And obviously you're talking there about sort of different perceptions and sort of different locations. What, you know, obviously this is a big event for yourself, and obviously you probably have lots of different aims and goals, but if there was sort of one thing that you would specify as your goal, what would you say it is? Would it be sort of inclusion, perception, or both? Or is it kind of a case of you just trying to spread sort of positive messages? What's the aim for you in this?
I absolutely do want to spread positive messages, and there maybe is a little bit of a selfish element to this for me, in that I enjoyed the one in Glasgow so much, I just really want to do it again. And being able to organize this and have a hand in it where I don't have to travel 3.5 hours to get to it and stay overnight, that's the dream. And I was so happy when things came off. But I think if I was to set out and say this is what I want to achieve with this one, so I might reference the one in Glasgow quite a lot, just because that is basically what I based this entire thing off of. But the one in Glasgow, we had quite a good response. I had a lot of people coming up to me afterwards and saying, oh, well, we took this from it, or coming up to me and saying, how can we work together to make things better? But one of the overriding feelings I got was that we were preaching to the choir, that most of the people in the room were either already on our side or already LGBTQ plus and involved in sport, or you know, whatever thing that they could already relate to. They were going in and they were hearing what they wanted to hear, and it was still a very fun thing to be a part of, and still very valuable to have all those people in one place. But I think what I would really love to do is change some minds, and that doesn't have to be somebody going in with a prejudice that comes out thinking, oh, actually gay people are all right, or gay people should be involved in sport. When I say change minds, I do genuinely mean if someone from Ross County comes along to it, if they can go away thinking, oh, I hadn't considered this perspective before, I hadn't considered this experience before, this is something I'm going to be more conscious of going forward, or this is something we can come up with a plan of attack to guard against going forward and help make things better going forward. That's what I would really love to come out of this. And that's part of the reason, again, I'm really grateful to all of you for coming together and doing this podcast, because I think this is possibly how I'm going to reach those people and some of those fans, and you know, maybe some people who I might not have access to from within the community or within sport, and say, this is a really cool thing, come along to this, and they'll come along to it because it's me and because they trust me. Maybe this is a bit of a wider platform of somebody who has maybe heard me and maybe has vaguely seen that this event is happening, but doesn't really know what it's all about, and maybe doesn't really have a strong opinion, who can come along and actually hear firsthand what it's like to be LGBTQ plus in sport, and what some of the issues are, and maybe how we can go about fixing them.
So, oh, go ahead, Ross.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in. I guess it's, as you said there, Andrew, like to have this panel of people that are in the LGBTQ plus community involved in sport, but also that have connections to the local area as well. I think it's obviously such a strong factor as well. You know, people from Inverness, people that are playing for Inverness, Cali Thistle's women's team and things like that. People that are going along to these panels can, you know, not just relate to the community they're part of, but also can see that, you know, they've come from the local area that we're in. Sometimes it can feel a little bit isolated up in the north of Scotland compared to, as you've said there, down in the Central Belt, where you're in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And, you know, you've got more of these kind of events, or the kind of the more, I don't want to say engaging communities as such, that's maybe not the kind of the right phrase, but, you know, up here we can feel a little bit detached from things like that. So for the people going along, they can see that there are people that, you know, have come from their local area that are part of this and gone on to succeed, and can hear their experiences as well.
Absolutely. There are role models out there. I feel like sometimes in the North, in the Highlands specifically, we sometimes have to work a bit harder to find some of those role models, to find some of those opportunities that are out there. And that's just in general, regardless of whether you're LGBTQ plus or not. You can then amplify that to being part of the LGBTQ plus community, where it's almost an old cliche, but you will genuinely find people who are the only gay in their village, right? And they must feel so isolated. They must feel so alone because they won't see any of that firsthand. It must feel like a dream to them to see people on TV going and living as their authentic selves. And it might not feel like something that's possible. But we have people on this panel who are from the Highlands, who are local to this, who, like I say, have made it to the very, very top of their sport. In some cases, the Fitness with Pride I mentioned earlier, the guy that runs that is called Ant Colasso, and he's got a brilliant story. I interviewed him a couple of months ago and wrote that up for the Inverness Courier. He grew up in Inverness. He's also biracial as well as gay. So he kind of felt that isolation on a couple of different fronts. And he couldn't really have gotten out of Inverness quickly enough. He left when he was 16 to go down to a big city in England and do some training as a performer. And he ended up going around the world, performing on cruise ships and, being on stages, living his dream. And he's now moved back to Inverness because he's seen some of the progress that's happened in the time he was away. He wants to be a part of that, and he wants to continue that charge. So it is a really common thing where people, LGBTQ plus people, in areas like the Highlands feel like they have to move away to be able to embrace who they are, which should never be the case. But hopefully, fingers crossed, touch on wood, something like this panel can show people that it's possible to do that, whether that is a case of having to leave and then come back, or whether that's just a case of being able to be settled where you are. There are these people out there who have done it, who are living proof that it can be done. So why not you? That's just as important a thing as well, to hopefully get people taking away from this.
Can I ask, Andrew, probably good to get an idea of what the sort of the event itself, the structure of the event itself for people listening in, because I agree with what you're saying there is sometimes you imagine as you said, you've got this sort of vision in your mind that you're preaching to converted all the people there. And the ideal scenario is you're attracting everyone in from every walk of life so they get an understanding of the stories involved in that. So could you maybe go through a wee bit of how the event is structured and the ideas behind it? Because I think that'd be important to get that message out to people listening in so that they actually think, well, actually I might want to go along to this and hear the stories behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the structure, how the night will run, we've sort of set aside roughly 45 minutes for each panel, which hopefully is going to be plenty of time for everybody to tell a few stories, talk about their own lived experiences of being LGBTQ plus in the Highlands and in sport. Ramsay mentioned it earlier that it's Football versus Homophobia month, but it's also LGBT History Month. So this has kind of been my thing over the last week or two. It's been trying to come up with the questions and make sure that there's something that everybody can take some value from. And if anything, I'm worried that I've got far too many questions to fit into those 45 minutes. I'm not worried about filling the time at all. If anything, I'm worried about overrunning massively on both of them. So the idea is that I'm going to be hosting or moderating or whatever you want to call it, both of the panels. I'm going to be going to each of the people on them, asking them some questions about their background, about the projects that they're involved in, about their opinions on what the state of sport is for LGBTQ plus people, maybe even a little broader with it being History Month, and just what the state of play for LGBTQ plus people is in the Highlands right now in general, much wider than sport. We're going to hopefully have some funny stories. We're hopefully going to have some, really triumphant stuff there. But we're also not going to shy away from some of the really serious stuff, because there are a lot of headlines out there right now, particularly when it comes to trans people, but in general, when it comes to LGBTQ plus topics in sport that aren't particularly inspiring, if I'm going to put that very, very nicely. And I talked before about getting the chance to hear from people who have been there and done it. Something that I'm really huge on is, instead of talking about LGBTQ plus people, or for that matter, any other marginalized community, talking to them, listening to them, getting their perspectives on it, because nobody's going to know what life is like for LGBTQ plus people in the Highlands better than LGBTQ plus people in the Highlands, right? That just makes sense. So we're going to have some of those serious topics that are going to be approached as well, and hopefully we'll do them justice in the format that we're running. And as I say, we're hoping to have a Q&A at the end of each panel for audience members who come along and might have a question that they maybe don't understand, or that they hadn't really thought about until that, or that they've seen something in the media and thought, well, let's put this to somebody who's actually living that experience. That chance is going to be there for people. So, I mean, like I said, I'm approaching this as a fun thing for me to do, but I'm very conscious that it could have a lot of value, and it could be a real learning experience for a lot of people too. So if you have ever seen the headlines and thought, what's all the fuss about? Come along. We're going to address that, and hopefully you'll come away with a greater understanding of why maybe some of the headlines are overblown a bit and what the reality of the situation really is.
Do you sort of feel
like your question, Stephen? Sorry.
No, it's great, Andrew, because again, one thing I saw years ago on TV now, and it was Gabby Logan, and it was to do with women in sport, specifically women in football. And I wouldn't say I had a preconceived idea at the time, but I thought I understood a lot more than I did. And it was really nice because it was this, and actually at the end I got quite sort of angry about it, because I thought, why is this not available to everyone to understand and hear? And it was very much about, it wasn't anyone standing up there and saying, preaching about women should be doing this or women should that. It was literally, they were just talking about their experiences and stories involved in sport. And when you actually understood what they'd gone through and the lives that they'd lived because of the events that took place, you actually had a real sort of empathy and understanding, and it actually made you want to say, look, this needs to change a wee bit here. Do you know what I mean? We all think we're doing a bit towards it, but we maybe just don't understand it. And I just felt it was like it broke down barriers because it was so unthreatening. It became the actual, what I would say is what you want it to be. Like, I imagine every equality is, it just becomes the norm, that everyone accepts it for what it is, and that's it, you know? And it was just, I just felt a really quite inspiring in that, and you had a real empathy then for what women were going through in sport. And I imagine that's my hope and expectation of your event, is that it has that same impact. But someone like yourself, Andrew, who's so passionate about it, and that, it's like us guys all doing the podcast. You know, we all do it because we're passionate about Ross County and want to get stuff out there. And it'd be the same for yourself, having that passion for it. And if anyone can send a positive message, it'll be yourself, Andrew, for sure.
I feel like you've almost put it better than I have there, Stephen. What you've talked about watching that program from a couple of years back, that's exactly what I want people to be thinking and feeling if they're at the panel and coming away from it. It is that empathy, it's that understanding. I sometimes feel like I'm too close to it, and I sometimes lose a bit of that perspective of what somebody who isn't part of the community, somebody who maybe isn't involved in sport, actually thinks about these issues, because I'm living them all the time. I'm seeing these headlines every single day. I'm talking to people on a regular basis. I would go as far as to say, and I really hope this doesn't come across as arrogant, because I try my best not to be a cocky person, but I'm pretty confident no journalist in Scotland has talked to as many LGBTQ plus athletes as I have. So like, this panel is coming from lived experience. It's also coming from a bit of a place of expertise, trying to reach people like you watching that documentary. And hopefully it can have that impact, because I don't know, I think, again, this might be a bigger thing that we might want to touch on later. I sometimes think Scottish football, Scottish men's football specifically, can be quite complacent when it comes to some of these inclusion campaigns, particularly when it comes to LGBTQ plus ones. So yeah, I guess there's an element of me kind of saying, I wish some of the clubs were doing this, so I'm going to go and do it myself a little bit and try and get that message across. And absolutely. Hopefully people come away from the panel exactly how you were feeling watching that documentary. That would be the absolute ideal.
I think, so speaking of men's Scottish football, I think football in general and a lot of other sports are let's face it, within like dressing rooms. You get, like, for anyone listening on an audio podcast, quotes, locker room talk. That can be quite, let's face it, overtly homophobic. Do you think it's important that this is a sort of like an LGBTQ panel, but also like specifically also like an LGBTQ in sports panel as well?
Yeah, 100%. I'm going to sort of look over at my notepad here at some of the stats, because I feel like this might be a good point to bring some of those in. And I wanted to get some specific numbers, because I feel like I've banged on quite a lot about things like LGBTQ plus people have worse mental health, have worse physical health, are less likely to be involved in sport, without having the specific numbers to hand, because I've just gotten so used to saying those things and the fear that like maths will put people off. But when you're talking about locker room banter, there was an Out for Sport study in 2019 that showed a third of LGBTQ plus people involved in sport, like actively participating in it, weren't out in sport. And there's a reason for that. And a lot of it will be some of that banter. It will be the environments. It's the comments that they're hearing, which just isn't good enough. You know, a third might seem like a small percentage, but that's a huge amount of people when you scale it up to something like men's football with the hundreds of thousands, if not more than that, people playing it across the country. You know, that's a huge amount of people who are actively being affected by something like homophobia in football. And I'll throw another one in here. Why not? There was data from June last year that says 78% of LGBTQ plus people wouldn't even consider playing grassroots football. So, I mean, that's a huge number. 4 out of 5 people in the LGBTQ plus community wouldn't even think about playing grassroots football. That's insane. That's a cultural thing. That's an institutional thing at that point. And one of the questions that I often ask people is whether society has to change before sport changes, or whether sport can lead the way. And people have different views on that. I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong. I personally think in Scotland, with the influence that football has, with how embedded it is in our culture, football can be a real leader when it comes to societal change and something like LGBTQ plus inclusion. So if football doesn't do anything about it, that message isn't going to get through. If football takes a stand and really makes an active effort to put out that message that we're a place for everybody and homophobic shouts are wrong and will not be tolerated, that will seep through. It might take a little while. It might be slow. It might be for some people and not everybody, but that's fine. That will start to seep through, and that's when you will see society start to take some of that on board as well. So yeah, there's absolutely that intersection where LGBTQ plus people don't feel welcome in sport. Historically speaking, sport hasn't wanted LGBTQ plus people. So to have an event like this showcasing the intersection of the two of them, and I'll go back to the phrase I used before, showing that it's possible, showing that you can do it and you can thrive in it as your authentic self. I mean, that's my perfect niche in terms of, you know, my interests and stuff like that. I really hope that comes across and we can benefit that particular area for sure.
More gaps. Perfect.
Cut these out. It's fine.
Yeah. Well said, Andrew. Sorry, was someone else about to speak? No. Okay. So you're talking about sport. We'll continue talking about sport, and more specifically Highland football. So if we go back a few years, Malky Mackay was appointed head coach of Ross County.
And, right into the deep end, are we?
Yeah. Well, we don't have to talk.
No, I'm fine with it. I wondered if you build up to Malky Mackay chat, but no, just going right in for that, talking about Highland football. Here we go.
Yeah. So a few years ago, Malky Mackay was appointed Ross County manager, to a lot of conversation, obviously, without wanting to zero in on Malky too much. He has a history of really sort of unacceptable comments around so many different groups, including and not limited to LGBTQ people. When you saw that in the news, sort of how did you feel? How did it make you feel? And sort of what was your initial reaction?
So just to be absolutely sure, you're asking about when I saw in the news he was going to be Ross County manager, not when the comments were made like 10 years ago.
Well, either or, but more when he was made Ross County manager. Did you feel like it was an indictment of maybe Scottish football not taking these things seriously enough? Or
that's a good question, because I'm not sure I ever scaled it up to Scottish football sort of bigger picture. I was furious. I know you've said some things about it. You guys have all, I think, had discussions about Malky Mackay being appointed as Ross County manager. I remember watching the odds the day before he was appointed just tumbling. And there was a point where he was the favourite, and I was like, really? That's surely not. Surely that's not going to happen. And then he was evened And I was like, maybe there's something in it. And then he went something like 8-1 on. And I was like, oh my God, they're actually going to appoint Malky Mackay as manager. And I was absolutely outraged. I could not believe it. And that first press conference with them, that was still in the Zoom era during COVID. And I've never seen so many reporters on a Zoom call. There must have been 40 or 50 people on that Zoom call. And we were limited to 2 questions each, just for time and practicality, which I totally understand. And half the questions were about those comments that he'd made. And I think rightfully so, because they had to be dissected. They had to be analyzed. This was his return to day-to-day football management for the first time, really, since all that had broken and had become this huge scandal. And I know none of you were on that call, and there was no reason anybody else on the call should have been just watching me. I had a face like thunder that entire press conference. I just was not happy at the situation. And for months afterwards, I made a point of wearing like my LGBT badges when I was either at a press conference in person or at a match. I've got like a football pride one. I've got a rainbow laces one. I was wearing all of them at every possible opportunity just to really sort of hammer home that message that I am here. This is what I stand for. If you don't like it, we might have an issue, because I didn't want to risk anything slipping out and it being called banter in inverted commas, because I wasn't going to stand for that at that point. The interesting thing about Malky Mackay, and for what it's worth, I have said to him to his face, I was not happy that he was appointed. So none of what I'm saying to you guys here is like a big secret or a big reveal. I have had this conversation with Malky. Because of his background, when Rainbow Laces came around that year, I approached the club and asked if Malky would be happy to do a sit-down interview with me about homophobia in football and about the Rainbow Laces campaign. And to his credit, he agreed. And we sat there after his usual press conference, and most of you guys have been to his press conferences. You know how they run, and you know that if we were out there in 25 minutes, that was usually pretty good going. If anything, they'd usually be longer than that. And we sat and chatted for another 30, 35 minutes after a usual press conference about homophobia in football. And he took on board pretty much every single question that I could have asked him. And there was one question he didn't answer, which he went off the record with me and explained was due to legal reasons. And because he went off the record, I won't say any more than that. But other than that, I thought he said the right sort of things. And he didn't shy away from doing that sort of interview, which would have been really easy for him to do given his past. And I came away from that interview, to be honest, with quite a lot of respect for him. I didn't agree with those messages that had been sent in the past, but we were 8 years on at that point, and he had been through, I can't remember exactly what it was called, if it was like sensitivity training or equality training, inclusion training, whatever it was called, that had been signed off and endorsed by Kick It Out, which is the anti-racism in football charity and campaign. They said years ago that he'd gone through this, and that was a positive step in the right direction. So after I properly sat down and had a conversation with them about homophobia in football, I kind of did a bit of a 180, to be fair. And I went from being really angry that somebody with his past and somebody with his reputation had been appointed Ross County manager days after Roy McGregor had said that they had to get the identity back for the club. I mean, the timing of that was just impeccable. And by the end, I got on really, really well with Malky. And for what it's worth, I also asked him about women's football. I asked him about some of the divisions there and the misconceptions there. I also asked him about racism in football when Regan Charles Cook got some abuse online. And again, I thought he spoke pretty well on stuff like taking the knee and the importance of, he maybe didn't use this exact word, but the importance of being an inclusive space within a club and having that. And by the end of it, I was really happy to be working with him, to be honest. I really did just totally flip. And I'd gone from being genuinely outraged, as a lot of fans were, as you've alluded to, that he was appointed, to actually being really sorry to see him go. Because as far as I was concerned, he had made the effort, he had put the work in, and he had said pretty much all the right things. So I think Malky's a really interesting one in terms of second chances. And for what it's worth, I'm not going to tell anybody how to feel about Malky Mackay. If you think he hasn't done enough and you still draw the line on those comments that he made about 10 years ago, fair enough. You know, I'm not going to tell anybody how to feel. If that's a deal breaker for you and you don't want him involved in Scottish football, that's your opinion. I'm not going to argue with that. You're entitled to have that. For me personally, working with him and chatting to him pretty much every week, right now, I would probably be a Malky Mackay advocate, which is not something I ever thought I'd be saying 2.5 years ago.
Do you think that maybe, you know, speaks more volumes about the kind of thing you're doing, Andrew, and the fact that, you know, not necessarily to say that you're going to have a room full of people who are sort of hating towards your
I really
project.
Hope that wouldn't do well with it.
You know, does that kind of, you know, give you hope that, you know, people's perceptions can change? Like you've just given us a great example there, that there's living proof that it can be done.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community, that might be one of the best examples of how social media isn't real life. I so often see, I'm not going to speak for you guys because maybe my algorithms are totally different. Every single day I log on to Twitter and see abuse. Not always directed at me, very rarely directed at me, because I've tried to post as little as I can on there now. It's an absolute cesspit. But every single day I log on and see somebody in an argument or somebody just getting flat out abused. I remember actually having that conversation during the Qatar World Cup, which I don't know if that's something that anybody was going to bring up at some point. But there again, like every 5 or 6 tweets when I was scrolling through, I would see somebody abusing an LGBTQ plus person. And that can make it feel really, that can make the world and just life in general feel really alienating and unsafe. It's probably the simplest way I can put it. But actually, walking down the street in Inverness or in Dingwall, and I always have rainbow laces in my shoes or trainers, and I wear a rainbow on some hoodies that I've got and stuff like that. I've never felt unsafe. I've never felt like there's an issue. So social media isn't real life. I think most people either are broadly supportive or just genuinely don't care. And that's what LGBTQ plus people have to remember if they do feel isolated, if they do feel like they're struggling, that we think other people are worrying about us and care about us far more than they actually do. Chances are, I really hope something doesn't happen now, and this sounds like I've set somebody up. Chances are you could walk down the street with some sort of rainbow logo, whether it's a badge, laces, a hoodie, whatever, and be fine. And nobody would say anything to you. And it's that ambivalence, I guess, that's kind of the important bit when we come to this panel, because I know that LGBTQ plus people are going to be on our side. I know that there's a group of people at the exact opposite end of that spectrum who we will never be able to convince. And if you're hearing me talking about this panel and thinking, I don't agree with any of this, and there's not much they can say that can change my mind, and I'm going to go and tell them that, there's no point in you coming along. That's just a waste of everybody's time, right? Nothing's going to be solved there. Nothing's going to be fixed or changed. We're still going to be in our positions. You're still going to be in your positions. It's that middle ground that's the important bit. Like you're saying, people can change their minds. And kind of going back to what Stephen was saying earlier, I think most people probably think they know what life is like for gay people in the UK right now. But they might come along to this and hear, actually, it's not quite that simple. There's actually this other element to it. And those are the people that, when I say I don't want to be preaching to the choir, those are the people that I really think we can get on side. And those are the people that I think could really, really benefit from coming along to something like this. Because it's just that greater understanding. And when you understand somebody's perspective, you are far less likely to stand for abuse, and you're far more likely to acknowledge some attacks that are happening. And again, I'm being quite broad and general here. I can go into some more specifics if you want me to, but that might end up becoming a bit of a pile-on from me onto various different media outlets, which I'm not entirely sure we want to go into.
So speaking on that, I see comments on social media a lot that I'd call, it really annoys me. I don't know exactly what to call it. Let's just call it like aggressive indifference where people are like, "Oh, I don't care. Keep it to yourself." Really annoys me. Is it a matter of not only getting to the people that are genuinely indifferent, but also the people who are like genuinely like almost defensive about the fact that they don't care?
So that you're right. That is such a common thing. Whenever any club posts something on Twitter about rainbow laces, or whenever there's any sort of headline about a gay player or whatever, one of the first responses you'll see is, "Who cares?" Right? Haven't we moved past this now? But I have a few different responses to that, and the first one being, "You obviously care, otherwise you wouldn't have commented. Who cares?" Right? Nobody makes that effort to go and type that out, even if it is just a couple of words, if they genuinely don't care. So that is coming. You're right. It's defensive. That is coming from a place of that's coming from an opinion that's being held. It's not coming from a place of indifference. And if somebody thinks they don't care, but they would also make the effort to tell people that and kind of show off that they don't care, yeah, please come along to this panel. You will see why you should care, hopefully. I mean, I like to think that nobody hearing some of our panelists' stories will come away from that thinking we shouldn't care about this. When it's been institutionally anti-LGBT, and by it I mean sport, when something like men's football has historically catered to everybody but the LGBTQ plus community, that has an impact, and that's something we have to actively undo. That's not something that will just change by us not caring anymore and not doing anything. Those are harms and those are differences that we have to make an effort to welcome people in to reverse that trend. So yeah, for those people who say, "Who cares?" For one, obviously you do. For two, we actually should care. Like, this is still a big deal for LGBTQ plus people to have representation somewhere like men's football. There's been one Scottish men's player ever who has come out at a senior level, ever, in the 150 years of playing football. That's crazy. And that, like, statistically, there must have been far more people. And the fact that they haven't felt able to come out is why we should care. It's why we have to make the effort to make football a more welcoming place and a more inclusive place. And I feel like I'm going to let somebody else ask a question, because this might just evolve into one massive rant from me right now about these things. Like, in case you haven't noticed, I can talk a lot about these things. So let's break it up a little bit with another question, and we might come back to some of that.
I'll jump in then. So I guess over the years with campaigns like of Rainbow Laces and, Football versus Homophobia, in sport, we have seen, clubs and football associations try and endorse that and really put out the message there, show the support for it. That's progressed over the years from, I would say, from my view, but from your view, Andrew, obviously as part of the LGBTQ plus community. Do you feel the same? And do you feel like it's progressing and it's been involved at the pace it should be? Do you think there should be more kind of getting done at this stage for it being 2024, for example? Whereas when you look back over a period of time, it's certainly progressed, but do you feel like it should make more steps than it has, or can make more steps than it should?
I feel like there's a really cliche answer that I could give you, in that social progress never happens as quickly as you want it to. I absolutely think more can be done. I absolutely think more should be done. I understand quite a lot of the reasons why it isn't. And it's actually quite an important point I think you raised, that a lot of progress has been made, because I appreciate when I'm talking about these things, it can sometimes feel quite doom and gloom, like things are still really awful and really terrible. Actually, things have come a long way just in the last 3 or 4 years, never mind the last 10, 15, 20, whatever. And Rainbow Laces celebrated its 10th year in 2023. Football versus Homophobia Month of Action is having its 15th year this next month, or this month, depending on when this goes out, I guess. And so much has changed in that time. It's crazy. Like, even 10 years ago, if you had said to me that on Sky Sports coverage of a top English Premier League game, there would be rainbows everywhere, that would have been totally alien to me. I would have loved to have seen that, but I would never have thought that was possible. And that's a reality now. We see rainbows with the scoreline. We see rainbows on the mics. We see people like Graham Souness having conversations about going to Pride, which is brilliant. And that's the kind of thing that we need more of. But all of those examples that I can point to, and there's more. I've seen people have rainbow corner flags, rainbow nets, tifos in the crowd, things like that. Pretty much every single example I can point to is in England. So what really sticks out to me is that I feel like it's an afterthought in Scotland. I feel like Scottish society has, generally speaking, in recent history, been more progressive than the rest of the UK. Scotland was the first country in the world to embed inclusive education as a part of school's curriculum. And I think things like that, moments like that, have led to a little bit of complacency when it comes to Scottish football, and maybe to an extent general society in Scotland. But that definitely is a conversation for a whole other day. Where I looked at the Rainbow Laces campaign the last couple of years, and this is even after a player has come out and referees have come out, and we should have more momentum than ever, and we should have more options than ever to go to and say, let's do this kind of content to market or that kind of content to market. And I saw nothing from any club for Rainbow Laces over the 2.5 weeks up until the SPFL put out a tweet. And then I saw a load of people retweeting it. And it's great that they're doing that, but that's also like the lowest possible bar that they can hit, is clicking one button to retweet one message, and that's all they do for a Rainbow Laces campaign. And I'm going to be very interested to see who does what for Football versus Homophobia, because over the last few years, some clubs have been really, really good at it. And sometimes it's the clubs you wouldn't always expect. Celtic and Rangers are actually by far the best in Scotland for showing these messages and making an effort and having the players involved and having supporters groups involved and tying all that sort of stuff in, which, considering the religious connotations with both of those clubs, you might not expect, but it's true. They do make a really big effort, at least comparatively, to basically the entire rest of Scottish football. I say that's maybe unfair to one or two clubs, but as a generalization, Celtic and Rangers are much, much better than the vast majority. And I get why. I really do. There's a lack of resource across Scottish football, and that's both financially and in terms of manpower. Clubs see it as a burden, I think. And maybe, again, I'm unfairly characterizing that, but I think clubs see this as something they have to do instead of something they want to do. And maybe that's where some of the messaging can change, where we can really try and impress upon them why this is a valuable thing to get behind and a valuable message to be putting out, and why, if you can and you're in a position to do more than a quick tweet that takes 5 minutes to put together and sharing a graphic that the SBFL have put out or the SFA have put out, that can actually have a strong benefit to it, to the supporters or young players or whoever. My perception of Rainbow Laces and Football versus Homophobia is that they are great campaigns to have. They have absolutely done some good. They have helped build some of the platforms for the positive steps that we've seen in the last couple of years. But they're also so frustrating to me, as somebody who sees what 4th and 5th tier clubs in England are doing, and that's more than Scottish Premiership clubs. And that doesn't make sense to me. And knowing how important of a role sport can play in so many people's lives, particularly a demographic that haven't had access to that, like the LGBTQ plus community. And maybe I'm just too close to, again, fully accept that as a possibility. It's so frustrating to see barely anything get done. And I don't know, maybe that's harsh. There'll probably be some football fans listening to this thinking, well, we saw the club put this out and there were so many complaints under it, and if anything, they're doing too much. And from my point of view, it's not enough. And until every club sort of makes a concerted effort to do it, and not just a quick tweet or an announcement over the tannoy before kickoff that nobody listens to anyway, not enough's being done until we have more than that, in my opinion.
And I guess that kind of leads on to the point I was going to make, that's kind of why we all came together for this idea to do this joint podcast between, myself and Stephen have got a different reach of people. Peter and Ramsay have got a different reach of people as well, and some people are combined in there as well. And the fact that we can help, the fact we can help kind of promote, the event and help raise awareness for this, we were really keen to do it because obviously we know you've been very supportive of both of our podcasts, and any time that we've been there, we want to be supportive of you as well in terms of the event, and also the Rainbow Laces in Football versus Homophobia and everything that means to you because of the passion that you've got for that. So I think it's important that you mentioned like the Celtic and Rangers and how they can get the fan groups involved and things like that, and that's kind of our aim from this kind of joint podcast here in the two parts, is that we're trying to kind of do a little bit similar here for it too.
Yeah, and I said it before, I will probably say it again multiple times before the end of the podcast. I really appreciate all of you doing this and having me on and talking about this and just dedicating some time to this issue, because this is the kind of thing I would love to see clubs doing. There was one, I can't remember if it was for one of those campaigns or if it was because of some chants that were going on in the crowd, but I remember watching a video a year or two back of Jurgen Klopp sitting down with the head of the Liverpool LGBT fan group. And it was just a really fascinating conversation. It was only 5 or 6 minutes, so it wouldn't have taken a huge amount of work other than finding some time in Jurgen Klopp's schedule to pull off and put together. And seeing those sorts of figures getting involved in the conversation and putting out those messages can do so much more than someone like me, even as a journalist, especially if people know I go to this well quite a lot. A figure like that will have so much more impact than I can have, because people look up to them. People might read what I'm writing, they might trust what I'm writing, but I highly doubt anybody looks up to me in the same way somebody would look up to Simon Murray, for example, or years gone by, Marcus Fraser was the club captain, Ian Vigurs was the club captain for a while. If those figures come out and send these messages, that's what's going to get cut through to people that maybe wouldn't have thought they would agree with it before. So yeah, hopefully we reach some more people here. And talking about like fans and fan groups, I don't know if there are the numbers for it, but I would love to see a Ross County LGBT supporters group start up. I would love to see it. I think that could have a hugely beneficial impact, and having that direct link to the community from the club's point of view, I think would be really good too. I don't know if there have ever been any attempts at starting one. As I say, I don't know if there are the numbers to really sustain it, but I know that I actually interviewed the guy maybe about a year and a half ago now that started up a Queen of the South one. So it doesn't have to be these huge clubs. It doesn't have to be a Celtic or a Rangers or a Hearts or a Hibs. It can be some of the slightly smaller clubs who maybe do have a more spread out fan base, who can still bring, even if it's 6 or 7 people together, that can still be a really good thing for them. And it might encourage people who otherwise wouldn't attend a football match to actually go along and enjoy the experience. So, I mean, long term, I'm certainly not going to say, guys, let's have an LGBT supporters group started up in the next 2 or 3 months. I'm by no means saying that. I'd love that to happen. But long term, I think that's something realistic that the club can aim for. And if that was to be a thing, I would love to interview the person who is setting that up. So yeah, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, I could do that, get in touch and I will help you get the message out there. And it's definitely not just me fishing for interviews at this point.
You heard the man, get in touch.
Just one thing Andrew was going to say is, obviously you sort of referenced there, you feel sometimes you're maybe too close to it, when you're making comments and that. But I wouldn't say you were, because my look at and take at it is, when I've seen stuff like show races and the red card or anything like that, or the rainbow lace, I always feel the campaigns are taking the knee. It always feels a wee bit like the token gesture, as you said, that the clubs have to do. And I feel they sort of miss the education and the story behind it rather than that. So I understand why it's important the clubs do it, to try and raise awareness. So I'm not criticising that. But it seems like it's just a structured thing in their calendar that they now do. And I think they missed the point. And I've always thought, like, for example, when we were down at Tynecastle, in the fantastic stadium they've got there, and they've got these brilliant, massive display boards, which is talking about the games, before it and that and stuff. Why not have 5-10 minutes of different stories each game, telling people the life that someone's lived and what they've gone through. And I actually think that would be more impactful than players coming out and just holding a red card above their head or wearing laces or anything like that. I think people actually hearing that and seeing it in the stadium go, you know, these are people around us in the stadium that are having these experiences right here, right now. I might actually think before I say or do or anything else around it. Do you know what I mean? I think that's the sort of important thing. And it's interesting you're talking about Sky and that. I always feel that Sky have, for want of a better word, commercialised some of the stuff behind the rainbow laces and that. And again, I feel it becomes the norm, and I feel sometimes they have to freshen things up. I think they have to do more things, like you said about Jurgen Klopp's interview and all these wee small things. I think it's about the stories and the experiences that people have is the key to all this, to get it out there. So when you're saying you might be too close to it and banging your drum, I don't think you are, because you're just getting your passion across for it and the life that you've lived and the experiences you've had. And I think that's the most important thing. And if anything, I hope that if football clubs are listening or people are involved in football are listening, I hope that's the element they take from it, is how can they get that across? And for me, one of the simple things is start hosting these events in football stadiums. That's an easy win. Do you know what I mean? It's an easy win, but it gets you in that environment so you can actually start talking about it.
So I started laughing when you said that last bit, Stephen, because I love that we've got Eden Court. I think it's a phenomenal venue, and it's possibly the best that we could possibly have for this. We did have a conversation about whether to host it at one of the football stadiums.
Yeah.
And again, sorry guys, I know this is a Ross County podcast. We did approach Cali Thistle about doing it. I think they would have been really keen for it. And in fact, I know they would have been, because I've talked to people at the club about it. And we kind of thought maybe this is a draw in and of itself, saying that we're going to hold it at the stadium, as well as the people that we're going to have along. And it would be a chance for LGBTQ plus people to go and be at the stadium and maybe get used to that surroundings a little bit if they haven't been so comfortable with it and haven't been so familiar with it. As it happened this time around, having the event on the 9th of February meant that it was Scottish Cup weekend, and there was no way of knowing what the fixtures were going to be until like this past week. So that was just going to be far too short notice for us to actually make that happen. But we have had those same thoughts. And I think I haven't had the conversations with Ross County, but I'm sure if I went to Stephen Ferguson and said, hey, look, we'd love to do this at Ross County, I honestly don't think he'd have any issue with that. I think he'd back us all the way.
Yeah, no, I think they'd practically encourage it, to be honest, Andy. I think they would be more than up for it. But I always just think it's like, try and get it in that environment, because I think that makes the most impact when you're then discussing these subjects and that, and again, talking to people's life experience. And again, I go back to that documentary I was watching with Gabby Logan, and I think it was at Manchester City's ground it was at the time. And as I said, I got really angry afterwards, because I was like, this is great, and it's just people talking about their experiences. And I wish that, you know, it was a room full of women going through their experiences. And I was like, how great would that if it had been dispersed with men and different people from different backgrounds, so everyone could get an overview of what every different background has gone through in their lives and that and stuff as well. And I think that's the important thing. And that's what I'm referring to again, is about the campaigns that are done, the Rainbow Lace and all that. It starts off with the best of intention to raise awareness, and that's vitally important. But it just becomes, for me, like the calendar event then that you just expect, you know, and people then say, oh, well, we're endorsing it or we're supporting it. But then for me, they need to change it up. They need to go that bit further and do that different things to get the messages out there.
Yeah, because fans zone out, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you see them, players running out with the show races on the red cards. That was more difficult to say than I thought it was going to be. and you go, oh, it's that weekend.
Yeah.
But there's no build up to that. It's maybe a message on social media the day before, maybe. It's them running out with the t-shirts or with the cards or whatever the case may be for that moment in time. And then it's gone. And then it's forgotten about. And you're absolutely right. Clubs should be mixing it up a little bit more. Clubs should be getting a bit more creative with it. Like I say, I understand that's difficult. I mean, I've talked to the media guys at both Ross County and Cali Thistle. I also know people that work for sports clubs and the media side of things in other sports. And they've come to me and said, well, how can we actually do this?
Yeah.
What's the way to approach this? And I've said, well, you could go down this route. You could go down that route. You could do this, whatever. And inevitably either ends up being too short notice to arrange some of that stuff, or they don't have the time that they can take out of their day to sit and dedicate to that. And I understand that. I totally get that. Not every club is in a position to do a week's worth of content, building up to and showing why it's important. It's just a case of doing what you can. And you talked about being at Hearts and having those screens. Yes, that's absolutely the kind of thing that people should be doing, because rather than seeing a message on a t-shirt or hearing a PA announcement, that is relatable suddenly. Everyone, right? Fans, journalists, players, whoever. That's relatable because you see a real person talking about their experiences, a real person talking about the impact that either the negativity has had on them or the positivity has had on them. Both are just as important and both are equally valid. And like you say, you start to think, oh, well, maybe that's somebody 2 rows behind me. Maybe that's somebody a couple of seats over from me. How must they be feeling right now? Do I change the way I act to make them feel better? And it's not about caving into wokeness or whatever people want to call it. It's just about being aware and caring about other people. That's what it comes back to at the end of the day. So the more that we can humanize that, and this is where I also go back to what I said before about, instead of talking about the community, talk to them, because it's so easy to talk about the LGBTQ plus community as a demographic, but you talk to people within them, they will still have different opinions, they will still have different experiences, and it's only by digging that little bit deeper and understanding where each person is coming from that you can actually then say, okay, I get it, and here's what we can do about it. So if more clubs took that sort of approach and did the things that you're suggesting, that would be great.
That's all for part 1 of this episode. Make sure to check out part 2 over on the County Corner podcast on your preferred streaming platform. Thanks to Ross and Stephen for collaborating for the first time. It's been a real pleasure. And a special thank you to Andrew for coming on to spread this message. It's an important one. So if you've got the time, I really would implore you to listen to part 2 on the County Corner. He goes on to speak in great depth about a number of different things. So also, please, if you can get down or up, head to Eden Court for Seen and Heard Live on the 9th of February at 7 p.m. If I know Andrew, I know his passion and I know what a great event he's going to put on. We'll put the link to Football vs Homophobia, Pride of the Terraces, Highland Pride and Leap Sport in the description, along with the event information. So do feel free to check that out. I think that's everything. So I'll hand you over to Ross and Stephen for part 2. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.